welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. This last week has been dizzying when it comes to Middle East news. As we speak, the president is in the region and has already made a number of announcements regarding a massive arms deal for Saudi Arabia and another one for Qatar. He announced lifting sanctions on Syria and even met with Ahmed al-Sharaa, the new president of Syria, for the first time. And it was the first time that leaders from both countries have met in 25 years. Meanwhile, Trump has promised a huge announcement on Gaza, which, as of this recording, we have yet to hear. And his administration is engaged in ongoing talks with Iran over a possible new nuclear deal. This all comes a week after Trump announced a truce with the Houthis in the Red Sea. All of this is happening without direct input from Israel, by all accounts. In fact, the president and his team have made a number of statements over the last week that have the nerves of the Netanyahu government jangling. Perhaps the most telling was when Mike Huckabee, Trump's ambassador to the UN, who was probably the most Zionist of his senior team, said bluntly to reporters, quote, "The US doesn't have to tell Israel everything that it is going to do." Both Steve Witkoff and Trump have said they want the war in Gaza to end, while the US has been engaging in direct talks with Hamas, getting Eden Alexander, an American hostage from October 7th, 2023, released this week as well. Rather than criticized, Trump seems to be gaining a lot of steam from his base on these recent moves, which one could say are 180 degrees different from the deferential treatment he gave Netanyahu and his government during the first Trump term. MAGA is not only split, but the most vocal appear very much attuned to the narrative that blind and unconditional fealty to Israel is not America first, and that a more realist foreign policy, one that puts American interests first, is the course that they voted for and want Trump to take. This, of course, is traditionally conservative foreign policy, as my guests today are going to talk about. Please welcome Brandon Buck, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute, who will be soon publishing his PhD dissertation, Partisans of the Old Republic, Right-Wing Opposition to U.S. Foreign Policy, and Andrew Day, Senior Editor at the American Conservative Magazine, who is also a prolific writer and a PhD. So we are pretty high up on the intellectual meter today. But in addition, these are two astute observers of what is going on in the Trump orbit today. So thank you for joining me, both of you.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, this is fantastic. Okay, first question. Trump gave some pretty audacious remarks to the Gulf state leaders and other, business types in Riyadh on Tuesday, and he seemed to be making a clean break with neoconservatives and the blob in Washington. I'll just give you a couple of his quotes. He said, "This great transformation has not come." When he talks about great transformation, he's talking about the building of Middle Eastern cities and commerce. And he says, "This great transformation has not come from Western interventionists giving you lectures on how to live or how to govern your own affairs. No, the gleaming marvels of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi were not created by the so-called nation builders, neocons, or liberal nonprofits like those who spent trillions failing to develop Kabul and Baghdad, so many other cities. Instead, the birth of a modern Middle East has been brought about by the people of the region themselves, developing your own sovereign countries, pursuing your own unique visions, and charting your own destinies." And then he said, "In the end, the so-called nation builders wrecked far more nations than they built, and the interventionists were intervening in complex societies that they did not even understand themselves." So I would like to ask both of you, what do you think of those remarks and the fact that Trump was making them in the Middle East before the leaders of the Gulf states, not Israel? And why do you think he chose this time to make these types of remarks, which are, pretty bold, as I said, in that they make a real break with the neoconservatives, many of whom are still in his own administration? I'll start with you, Brandon.
Well, as to why now, I mean, I'm not that astute, so I'll let Andrew field that one. But at least as far as the background goes, he's upending not only neocon assumptions about America's role in the world, but post-war assumptions about America's role in the world. This idea that the United States, that it isn't our place to tell other countries how to manage their affairs. I mean, this is an embrace of particularism on the international stage that the United States hasn't seen come out of a executive since, I don't know, maybe even the interwar period. So just the fact that he's able to or he's willing to, at least rhetorically, make this case, in spite of tradition, but also strong elements within, well, at least vocal elements within his own party, says a lot about the change within the party and the intellectual juice that it now has.
Yeah, and as far as the why now question, I mean, I don't think I can answer that either. Although, even though it feels like a million things have happened, a million important things since Trump was inaugurated for his second term, we should note it's still early in his administration. So this is evidently, a foreign policy priority to kind of have this break from neoconservatism, at least rhetorically. It's also worth noting that Saudi Arabia was also the first foreign destination in his first term. Technically, it's not in this term because he did go to the Pope's funeral in Rome, but this is his first major overseas trip. He's going to tour the Gulf states for, I believe, 4 days, starting in Riyadh. That clip or passage that you just read out, Kelly, is really blowing up in the Middle East, from what I understand. That was extremely well received. I don't know how representative it is of the speech entirely, because the speech was actually quite hawkish on Iran. I mean, he did extend this olive branch and say, he wants a deal rather than to make a war. But he's speaking in Saudi Arabia, a regional rival of Iran. He's trying to have some pressure on Iran in order to get this deal that he says he wants. And so he was willing to allow himself some kind of shots at Iran about how it's funding terrorism in the region. So it wasn't completely a dovish speech, but it definitely did reject neoconservatism, interventionism more broadly, as Brandon just said. And what I found interesting about that particular passage that you just read is it isn't just anti-interventionist, it's anti-interventionist in a very conservative way. It really resonates with American nationalism. He's talking about the kind of organic cultures of these various nations and how they should be allowed to, develop themselves. Rather than have this kind of, end of history sort of worldview imposed on them that every country is going to be a liberal democracy. As I said, I think that really resonates with American nationalism. I think that was implicit, that this is also something that the United States wants to do. It also doesn't want liberal elites imposing a certain worldview on the American people. And so, just to repeat my point, it was not just anti-neoconservatism and not just anti-interventionism, as Brandon noted. It was specifically kind of culturally conservative type of anti-interventionism. And, this whole trip has been super interesting. I can't remember if you said it, but I'll add one more data point for this kind of break between Trump and Netanyahu. And I think it might be the most important one. Steve Witkoff, his special envoy or emissary, went to speak to the Israeli families of hostages held by Hamas. And he told them basically that their government is the reason that their loved ones haven't been released yet. I mean, he was saying that the Netanyahu government doesn't want to end the war, even though there's no more progress that can be made, and this is delaying a hostage deal. I think that is extremely important because Trump is more popular than Bibi within Israel. Trump is very popular among Netanyahu supporters, and getting a hostage deal is more popular than continuing the war. Most Israelis would want a ceasefire if it meant the hostages will be released. Right. And so this really puts Bibi kind of on thin ice. It's kind of a signal to him that the Trump administration is willing to make problems for him politically.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big turn, because I can remember I don't even know, was it 2 months ago, where Steve Witkoff was interviewed by Tucker Carlson, and he was blaming Hamas for the hostages not being released, for the ceasefire not going forward, for the starvation of the people there. And because I remember being pretty miffed with the attitude, which seemed to be so in the pocket of Israel, like he was rattling off Israel talking points. I'm wondering what happened, because I do see this visible shift and the language, the fact that Trump isn't even going to Israel on this Middle East trip. Brandon, do you have any thoughts? I mean, I know that we can't climb into the heads of Trump and Witkoff and to how they're feeling, but what is your sense about this very real sort of, I don't want to say an isolation of Netanyahu, but they are going around him and making own policy?
Well, as far as to the proximate cause, I don't know, but I think at least the minimum, the principals in the Trump administration are perhaps sensing, or maybe they have their finger on the pulse of the base in the way that other thinkers in the conservative space perhaps don't. I mean, there's clearly a generational divide in Americans' views vis-a-vis Israel, and including within the conservative movement, the conservative base. Whereas like young conservatives are like relatively split on the topic of whether or not they favor the current status quo with Israel. So there's a wide political lane here for President Trump, and he seems to be driving in it now. And I think this has its roots with the global war on terror. I think perhaps he's acting now because there's been this drumbeat in conservative publications, not just the American Conservative, but others like the Federalist, and also just like a lot of just churn online. Like, we do not, MAGA that is, want a war with Iran. So perhaps someone in his ear, Vance, perhaps is making this known.
Yeah, Andrew, it does seem okay. So a month ago, we were talking, there was a lot of hullabaloo about Dan Caldwell being let go. He was a special advisor to Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary. There was a ton of intrigue about whether there was a leak investigation. Turns out there wasn't a leak investigation. I think there might have been a probe that didn't find any leaking. All that said, Dan Caldwell, who comes from the realism and restraint part of our orbit, had been let go. And there was a lot of concern that the knives were out for other restrainers who had been brought into the Trump administration, whether it be into the DOD or the State Department or other spaces, and that these neocons were just really revolting against Trump's picks. But all that said, it does seem with the ceasefire or truce that Trump had announced with the Houthis, the fact that he's going around Israel. The big story last week was that Mike Waltz had been let go because he had been talking with Netanyahu about potential attacks on Iran behind Trump's back. Two things are emerging here. Two, that the folks that are restrainers inside are fighting back and are probably talking to reporters about all this and writing great speeches for Trump. And two, Trump seems to be engaging in all of this, in which he's making these dramatic remarks to the Middle East. He's talking about lifting sanctions with Syria, possible nuclear deal with Iran. So, like, wow, what do you make of all this as somebody who's coming from a magazine that's been advocating for realism and restraint in foreign policy from the right?
So one thing that I'll say about Caldwell is initially the concern among people like ourselves was that this was some kind of ideological purge, or that there was some infighting going on that we couldn't see and that the Hawks had won. It started to become more obvious that it probably wasn't an ideological thing. It was much more personal, because it wasn't just pro-restraint people that Hegseth, that got the axe. So I think whatever was going on there had more to do with Pete Hegseth's incompetence and his paranoia about these supposed leaks, which, as you said, it's not even clear there was a leak investigation. It certainly doesn't seem like Caldwell was under investigation for leaking, because he wasn't even given a polygraph test, which would be standard if he was being investigated. Maybe the leak related to this brief that Elon Musk got about China, or that he was going to get until it got reported, I think, in the New York Times. It might have related to newspaper reporting on how bad the war in Yemen was going. I think Hegseth got paranoid, and basically he got rid of his own guys. He didn't take out the deep state. He got rid of the guys that he brought into the DOD, including the restrainer Caldwell, but also some not really pro-restraint people. So I don't think that was an ideological thing. The issue with Mike Waltz is quite interesting, and I think it might relate to your earlier question that you posed to Brandon about why we're seeing this row or rift between Trump and Netanyahu, because I think that Trump is starting to recognize, and people in his orbit are starting to recognize, that they can't actually accomplish their foreign policy goals if Netanyahu has veto rights over U.S. foreign policy. They clearly want to get an Iran deal. That is a major priority of the Trump administration. I think maybe it's even become more of a priority because it's looking less and less likely that they're actually going to be able to end the Ukraine war. I mean, we'll see, there's going to be these talks tomorrow between Russia and Ukraine and Istanbul. So maybe something good will come out of that. But it's starting to look like the Iran deal is the thing that they can get among their foreign policy goals. But it's going to require them to kind of bypass Netanyahu, because he's proposing this Libya model of fully dismantling the Iranian nuclear energy program. He clearly doesn't want there to be a deal. He was apparently talking to Waltz, maybe in a way that Trump perceived as undermining the administration. And one thing I'll note that I think shows that there probably is some, a lot of tension that the White House is aware of when it comes to the relationship with Israel and getting the Iran deal. On both occasions that Netanyahu has visited the White House, Trump used those occasions to kind of announce things about Iran. So the first time he was signing this maximum pressure executive order or presidential memo, but he said, I don't think everyone in Iran, I don't think all the Iranian elites actually even want a nuclear weapon. I'm signing this executive order, but I actually don't want to impose maximum pressure. I would rather, get a deal. And then the second time, Netanyahu pretended to be coming to talk about tariffs, but actually he wanted to talk about Iran and other Middle East security issues. And he wanted to convince the Trump administration, not to go forward with these negotiations that could potentially let Iran maintain its uranium enrichment program. And Trump, during the Oval Office meeting, announced that there were going to be direct talks between the U.S. And Iran. So that was a clear signal to Netanyahu and to the world that, Trump doesn't want Netanyahu to get in the way. Apparently also during that visit by Netanyahu, Bibi was encouraging the Trump administration not to lift sanctions on Syria, which Trump announced in his speech yesterday he's going to do.
The opposite. Yeah.
Right. So I think they just started to sense that, their Middle East policy, even though they were basically letting Netanyahu get what he wanted on Gaza, and they kind of gave him cover and the green light to end the ceasefire, he still wasn't playing ball and kind of helping them advance their own goals. It seems like he even was trying to sabotage this hostage release deal. He doesn't like helping. They had to go around him. Apparently Israel learned about it because they were like spying on us. Basically, their intelligence services that this was going on. So we didn't even tell them we were talking directly to Hamas, which is a huge break from diplomatic custom.
Oh yeah.
They would never spy on us. There's no history of that whatsoever.
So, Brandon, it doesn't sound like the neocons are as powerful on the inside, at least from what we're seeing today. Now, anything can change tomorrow, but come on. I mean, the fact that Trump is out there saying that he wants to make a deal with the Iranians, he's the one who got out of the JCPOA in 2018 at the urging, or actually the sort of coercion of the Israel lobby and the neoconservatives in Congress in 2018. Now he seems to be poised on getting a deal that looks a lot like the one that he ripped up. And I know he's going to probably do a little tweaking, maybe try for a few more concessions to make it his own. But I mean, people are really freaking out in this town right now because they thought they had, at least on that issue, they had Trump in their pocket, and it doesn't seem like they do. If anything, he's deliberately working against them.
Yeah, you just hate to see it. I'll tell you. What's been fascinating in the Trump era is seeing the rump of the neoconservative movement. Which it's funny because now they're actually running away from that label. I got a little bit of flack on X by calling people neocons, and they say, "Oh, I'm not a neocon because I eschew nation building." Like that's their barometer on what neoconservative is. But there's a whole other set of ideas around neoconservatism, either in its first or second generations, that conservative hawks, regardless of what labels they want to apply, still cling to, right? And that is that the United States has some sort of special relationship with Israel in the Middle East, and that is what guides American policy in the region. And very clearly, Trump is seeming to make a pivot on that, by looking more towards the Gulf states. So like, why now? I mean, it's interesting because the neoconservatives who want a maximalist position, be it complete disarmament or even regime change, are emboldened by Iran's position now, versus what it was 4 or 5 years ago. But it would seem to me that at least right now, the principles around the Trump administration sense the opposite. Like this is the time to deal. And I think perhaps the Gulf states are pushing them in that direction because they supported more maximalist aims 4 or 5 years ago, or certainly during the Trump administration. But that's changed now, and it for better or for worse, it seems that Trump is listening to the Gulf states more than Israel.
That's a great point. I mean, and during the Obama years when this deal was being debated, the Gulf states had joined Israel in opposing it. And so they formed a real force, and along with the neocons and Republicans in Congress and on the domestic side to try to defeat it. And so as far as I know, today they are a lot more sanguine about the idea of getting that deal. You're absolutely correct. Let's just shift before we run out of time a little bit domestically. More and more prominent conservative voices have come out to question the role of U.S. policy to protect Israel. And this was really gaining steam. I believe it was last week as Congress was debating an anti-Semitism bill that would, in effect, make criticizing Zionism and even the Israeli government as an offense on college campuses that receive federal funding. In effect, it was a speech code law. Marjorie Taylor Greene and Charlie Kirk, both prominent MAGA Republicans, came out strongly against it. At one point, MTG said, quote, "It is my job to defend America's rights to buy, or Americans' rights to buy or boycott whomever they choose without the government harshly fining them or imprisoning them. But what I don't understand is why are we voting on a bill on behalf of other countries and not the president's executive orders that are for our country?" I asked both of you, these aren't the Rand Paul libertarians, and Rand Paul had come out very strongly for this speech bill. But, the libertarians can always be counted on to defend the First Amendment. But, this is another part of Trump's base. What's going on here? Because when those two came out strongly against this bill, Steve Bannon came out and said, "I agree on all points." And so this has become even a MAGA cause. So what do you make of this, Andrew?
Well, I think there's a lot going on here. Trump is really serving, as Seymour Hersh once said, as a kind of circuit breaker, right? This neoconservative current was getting too strong, so Trump kind of came in and shut it off. I think a lot of that was because he wanted to distinguish himself in a crowded 2016 field by really criticizing the Iraq War and criticizing the neocons. And so he kind of created this opening for the ascendancy of the anti-war right. He's been sometimes inconsistent in his actions and rhetoric, but I think that's basically what happened. You mentioned Charlie Kirk. So one thing that's interesting to note right now is, this is kind of amazing, but there was this Pew Research poll that came out last month that showed that a majority of Americans hold an unfavorable view of Israel. And that is incredible. It was only like 53%. It was a slim majority. But interestingly, if you look at the younger cohorts, even the majority of young Republicans have an unfavorable view of Israel. And this kind of, corroborates what we've seen since October 7th, which, as the war has gone on, Americans have become much more hesitant about their government supporting this war in Gaza. And I think that this tendency is also strong among young people on the right. Charlie Kirk, he's the He's the founder and I think like the executive director of Turning Point USA, which promotes conservatism on high school and college campuses. And I've always found him to be a very useful weather vane for understanding where young people, young conservatives in particular, are at. Because even though he's trying to kind of change things in a more conservative direction on these campuses, he also kind of has to accommodate himself to where young people are in the Republican Party. Yeah. And he is, as you said, he's very opposed to a war in Iran. He was against it. I think it was a boycott bill, like making it more difficult to have organized boycotts. You could have like a prison term or $1 million fine or something ridiculous like that. He came out against that, which I was very glad to see because, Charlie Kirk used to be kind of trending in the direction of being like a Christian Zionist or something. I'm sure if you Google Charlie Kirk Israel, you get a lot of videos of him like shutting down people on campus for criticizing Israel. But now he's, kind of going along with this anti-interventionist sort of young person MAGA thing where he's willing to criticize, America's policy on Israel, which is basically kind of doing what Israel wants in the Middle East, and even having these, crackdowns on speech here in America. And he's objected to that. He didn't object when the Trump administration took the green card away from Mahmoud Khalil, the pro-Palestinian activist, and they're wanting to deport him. But I guess on this boycott stuff and on war in Iran, he's on the pro-restraint side. Same with Marjorie Taylor Greene, as you said. So I don't want to be too optimistic because if we're looking at anti-war conservatives and their strength, we have to see it in relative terms. And the weapons manufacturers and the Israel lobby and other lobbies and donors and stuff, they still are extremely powerful. They're still really prominent, hawkish Republicans like Lindsey Graham and Tom Cotton who have a lot of power. But this anti-war right is ascendant right now, clearly. There are very prominent voices, including lawmakers, who have kind of joined this cause. And, I think that's a great thing to see.
And I want to ask you, Brandon, since you've done a ton of research on this, one of the theories or criticisms that I have heard mostly from the left in the wake of Charlie Kirk and MTG and other prominent MAGA coming out against the anti-Semitism bill, anti-boycott, more interventionist talk, is that somehow it's coming from a dark place, that somehow they are truly anti-Semitic and they don't want to be stopped at some point from saying the Jews killed Jesus, or, it's not coming from a real honest, non-interventionist America First place. If it is America First, it's more of the Charles Lindbergh legacy place. And I know that just reading your work, that there is a long history of anti-interventionism on the right. And maybe what we're just seeing is some of that just punched through right now.
Yeah, I mean, even throughout the Cold War, some of the most ardent opponents of expanding the Cold War into the Middle East was the right flank of the GOP, and they defied Eisenhower on his doctrine, and they also defied Nixon when the United States became the primary arms dealer to Israel after the Yom Kippur War. I mean, there was a small opposition in Congress, but the opposition was made up by conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats. And in the language that they used was similar to other critiques about American intervention in other regions. And it was not racialized. It was not. It did not come from any kind of dark place. And to is why we're seeing it now. What's interesting is I think that Andrew mentioned that Pew poll, and what's interesting to me is that Boomer conservatives have not moved. They still maintain a particularly strong view of America's role with or relationship with Israel. I think a lot of that comes out of the 1973 war. Conservatives who came of age then, they viewed Israel as this upstart country that was being beset upon by its neighbors, which that was true at the time. And so that is their generational view of America's relationship with Israel. But now, those existential threats from its neighbors are gone, right? And now, Israel's primary security concern is asymmetric. It's vis-a-vis the Palestinians. So you have a new generation of Americans who have a fundamentally different view of Israel's role or Israel's actions in the Middle East, and that coupled with a new decentralized internet, narrative making complex has led to a new view of America's relationship with the state of Israel. And also you add on to that hangover from the global war on terror and a particular understanding of the costs of American extension in the Middle East, and it's pretty plain to see why there is a emerging generational divide going on here.
Absolutely. Well, we've run out of time, but I just would like to say or point out one thing. Another poll that came out earlier this week by the University of Maryland found that 64% of Republicans would rather see a deal with Iran than a war with Iran. And I think that's extremely notable given that divide between Republicans and Democrats over Iran and just, military issues in general when it comes to the Middle East. I mean, I know tomorrow we could have you back on the show and Trump could go in a completely different direction. So I'm not under any illusion that he is becoming a full-on restrainer. But I think, as you said, Brandon, there's a lot of energy, a lot of spirit that is not going to be easily overturned or diffused. I think J.D. Vance, the vice president, is really coming to from this place, and I think it's intellectually grounded and philosophically grounded, and I think it's notable. Like, he is the next in line to be the Republican heir to the White House, and if he's coming from that place, that means there are a lot of folks who he's enjoining within the administration. This isn't going anywhere. This isn't just a Trump thing. This is something that has historical relevance on the right, and I think you'll continue to see a battle over it between the neoconservatives and your old Cold War warriors, and would love to keep talking about it on this show in order to give it juice, because I think it's really important. And so thank you both for coming on Trip the Beltway. Fantastic this week.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.